Yeah, thank you so much for having me and inviting me to give this talk today. This is a talk, a lot of the research in this talk was part of my PhD, which I did in Australia. So there'll be a number of nice pictures of Australian plants that come up along the way. But the big kind of question that I wanted to ask in my PhD was, are plants already responding to recent climate change? So climate change, we know the statistics, we know the facts, we know that it will impact our Earth into the future. It will have big effects on plants in our natural ecosystems, like our forests and our grasslands, but it will also impact things like our crops and our food resources as well. So increases in temperature, decreases in precipitation, increases in extreme events like droughts and heat waves. We know that they're all going to have big impacts into the future. And scientists have spent a lot of time trying to predict how climate change and temperature increases and reductions in precipitation will kind of impact plants into the future. But we really need to know how plants have already responded to make better predictions. This is quite a difficult task, though, because in order to understand how much plants have already responded, we really need sufficient data on how they looked and grew and what their traits were in the past. And we haven't always measured this in the past as well, especially not with the technological advances that we have today. And once we have these measurements, we can see how much they've changed through time in response to climate change and then better inform these predictions in the future. But without having a spaceship or a special machine to time travel into the past and see what the plants looked like and measure these plants kind of in history, it's quite difficult. But during my PhD, I was actually able to travel back in time. And I did this in two ways. Using historic data, including seeds. So seeds were collected by botanists and ecologists decades ago, and sometimes even hundreds of years ago, and they could actually be dried out and frozen down and stored for many decades and even centuries as well. And this is a seed vault, which is at the Plant Bank, which is in Western Sydney in Australia, where they store hundreds of seeds of native species in Australia, some as old as 200 years. I also used historic data in flowering time and travelled back in time using herbarium. So herbaria are these big collections of pressed plants. The botanists have collected these shoots or flowers or leaves from plants, pressed them in paper and stored them in these shelves for many decades and again centuries as well they can keep. And also these old field notes that kind of pop up in herbaria as well. So I was able to unlock all this historic data, travel back in time, and really work out what our plants in Australia were doing decades ago to then work out how much they've changed through time and see if they've responded to climate change. In the first part of my talk today, I'd like to share a bit about this seed story and using historic seeds to determine if these plants are responding to climate change. So this is what the historic seeds look like. They're in these little vacuum sealed packages, and I unlocked a lot of them and then also went on field work for about 6 months to collect modern seeds across Australia from the same species in the same location as those historic seeds were collected by botanists in the past. This took me all across kind of Eastern Australia, lots of driving and flying around to various different states, collecting these seeds to match those historic seed collections. I then germinated the seeds, so that's placing the seeds on this agar solution to get them to produce their first roots and shoots, and the old seeds and the modern seeds are germinated side by side. And what's really cool is that the old seeds still germinate. And this is great news because we actually use seed banks to conserve our species. So people use these seed banks, collect these seeds, store them in these tiny little packets. It's really cost effective, it's really space effective, and we'll actually be able to use them to conserve plant species that might go extinct in the wild. We can pull them back out from the past, germinate them, grow them, and maybe even translocate them out into wild areas. Then I set up a massive glasshouse experiment after transferring those historic seeds and the modern seeds that had germinated onto these pots in soil, and I grew these plants side by side in the glasshouse for 6 months. So in the end, I had a really huge experiment with over 40 species of plants and around 2,500 individuals to look after. And those, modern and historic plants were growing side by side. So I was able to compare changes through time between historic species and modern species. But not only that, and the reason why I covered such a broad geographic area in my fieldwork is because I really wanted to know if these changes through time were actually related to climate change. Not just because there was a change in the population or the maternal plants were doing something different, but is this change between the historic and the modern plants actually attributable to climate change? So as you can see in Australia, since 1970, temperature and precipitation have increased and decreased to various different extents. So what I can do by covering this broad geographic area, I can expect that if I've collected a seed pair, so the historic and the modern seeds from somewhere where there's been a really stark increase in temperature and maybe quite a big drop in precipitation as well, I'm most likely going to see bigger changes in the plants. Maybe the plants are growing shorter, maybe they're producing less seeds, maybe their leaf shape is changing. And so that was my hypothesis. In those regions where the climate has changed more, we're going to see bigger changes in the plants and bigger adaptations in the plants as well. So what did I find? Well, I found that the modern plants were significantly shorter than the historic plants, but only in regions where we saw a really significant increase in heat wave duration. So when we have these extreme increases in extreme events like heat waves, we're actually seeing plants lowering their growth in things like plant height and also in the overall biomass that they're investing in their shoots as well. So this is probably kind of a strategy to conserve water for the plants rather than growing taller. I also found that as average temperatures increased, plants were actually making their leaves a lot smaller. Again, conserving water, less surface area to lose that water to the environment. Interestingly, I found that as the temperature became more variable in Australia, plants were actually producing seeds that were more viable and had better germination, so more successful seeds. And I think this is a parental investment of the plant going, I need to reproduce, the temperature and the climate is really unpredictable. I need to make sure my offspring will be able to adapt and survive in their little seeds. Yeah. Great question. It depended on the species, but it was around 50 years was kind of the oldest difference, and 35 years was the youngest kind of difference between the historic and the modern populations, but it varied for each species. Yeah. Interestingly, I found that there was no kind of significant differences through time in the chemistry in the plant leaves. And the chemistry of the plant leaves really gives us a good indication for how well defended the plants are. So how much they can protect themselves from insects and pathogens like fungi. But there was no change through time, and that wasn't related to climate either. And I think what's going on here is that not only are plants kind of shifting how much they're defended, they're also responding to how much insects are responding to climate change. So maybe as temperature increases, we might get more insect activity, but then plants are also able to put more investment in chemicals as well. And that's kind of where my postdoc goes now. So I've delved more into plant insect interactions in my postdoc. And if you want to know more about how they're responding to climate change, we're kind of getting the first results about that at the moment. And I'm happy to chat about that afterwards as well. So the big picture, plants were able to respond to climate change and in a range of different ways. This is hopeful and it's good news, as it may allow the survival of some species under future climate change, and especially for plants, because they don't have that ability like animals do to migrate to more favourable conditions. So really, adaptation in the places that they are is really vital for them to survive under future climate change. But will they actually keep pace under future climate change? Well, this is a big question. This was all kind of the last 35 to 50 years of how much plants had responded to climate change, but we know that climate change will ramp up in the next decades. So will these changes actually be quick enough for plants to be able to survive in the future? That's a big question that I have that I'd like to answer, but don't have the full picture for. And I think it's really important to consider as we go forward. Yeah.
So what's the shortest time frame that you only live in 35 years, but based on your knowledge, what do you think is the shortest time frame that plants can show adaptation over? Like, is it 2 years? A a year, a few months?
That's a good question. Plants, yeah. It depends what trait you're looking at. Some things are very plastic and they can show an instant response and switch something on or turn something off. Some things like plant height, you're not going to see for a couple of decades. It really depends on the trait and depends on the generation time of the plant as well. So how much time it has each time it reproduces. Some things can be a plastic response, so a fast change, or more of a genetic adaptation as well. It really varies.
Yeah. The rate of change is rate of change is changing quite rapidly also.
Yes.
Like the rate of change of temperature.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm hoping that some of this data will then go into studies where we can make comparisons between rate of climate change and rate of plant trait change and see which are the species that are going to be able to keep pace and which are the ones that might not survive. Yeah. So that was just a bit of a snapshot, part one, about using these historic seeds. And now I want to tell you a bit about how I went back in time and used historic flowering data to also work out if plants in Australia have been responding to climate change. So these are some of the really beautiful flowers that I got to work with. I worked with about 50 species that I observed flowering time for in this study, Australian species in the Sydney region, quite close to my home as well. So I combined herbarium records, which, as I was saying, they are these kind of cut pieces of plant material that are then pressed in paper and stored in these nice sheets in big shelves in these herbaria. And I combined that with historic flowering observations. And these were collected by a woman named Doreen Price in 1963. She wasn't actually a botanist herself. She was a doctor and she had really bad hay fever and she wanted to know what was flowering at what time so that she didn't go out and start sneezing every time she went for a walk in the forest. So she recorded in great detail when things were in flower. And this herbarium record on the left is actually from 1903. So you can see how things last over hundreds of years. And that's quite old for Australia's kind of botanical collection history as well. So not only did we combine these historic records, we also did some resampling of flowering time in modern day. So my colleagues in the lab in 2010 and 2011 went out and sampled the same species and looked at their flowering time. And then I came in 2018 and 2019 and basically just got to walk through a nice area of forest in Sydney and record what was in flower and what wasn't. So this gave us a really good snapshot about flowering time for about 50 different species in Sydney over the past 100 years. And that's actually the first time anyone's resampled this data and the first time anyone's got such a long historic data set of flowering time in the Sydney region. So what did I find with all this data? Are plants flowering earlier in the year? That's kind of what we predict. These springs are getting earlier, temperature is warming. Are these plants responding to that by flowering earlier in the year? Well, interestingly, plants were all over the place with their flowering time shifts. And very few actually flowered earlier through time. So some were, but very few. Interestingly, there were actually a few species that were shifting their flowering time later in the year. And then most showed no pattern across years of data collection. So most plants weren't actually shifting their flowering time over the past 100 years, even though in that Sydney region, we are seeing warmer temperatures earlier in the year. And that's quite a strange result. You might have heard that springs are coming earlier. Maybe even over your lifetime, you've watched a plant start to flower earlier in a backyard or in a natural space. And then there's these other studies, stacks of them from the Northern Hemisphere, that have all found the same thing, found the same case. Springs are getting earlier, plants are keeping pace with that, and they're flowering earlier in the year. One study from Japan last year, they even tracked cherry blossoms all the way back from 812, and they found a really stark drop-off in recent times where peak bloom has, sorry, I'll move out the way, where peak bloom has started to occur earlier in the year. So rather than being in late March, early April, it's now coming down to be just late March and even could end up being in early March as well. So that really begged the question, is there a difference in these flowering time shifts across the two hemispheres? Why are we seeing this different pattern in Sydney? Is there something going on that's just bigger than Sydney, not just what happened in my study itself. And so I went into the literature and I looked at studies from the Northern Hemisphere and studies from the Southern Hemisphere. And I wanted to compare how many species were advancing their flowering time, so going earlier in the year, and how many species were delaying their flowering time. Interestingly, what I found is that there is a difference between the two hemispheres. So you can see the green color here is the number of species that have advanced their flowering time. So they're the species that are going earlier in the year with their flowering, compared to the orange or the peach color, where species are actually delaying their flowering time. And you can see there's a very big number of species in the Northern Hemisphere that are advancing their flowering time compared to species delaying, but there's not as much of a gap in the Southern Hemisphere. So there is something different going on in the Southern Hemisphere, and the rates of climate change are very different in the Southern Hemisphere as well. There's a bigger volume of ocean, so we actually are having different rates of climate change compared to the Northern Hemisphere. And you can also really see clearly in this graph is that there's so much more data in the Northern Hemisphere as well. There's so many more studies coming out of Europe and North America. We have way more species that we have information for, but we can't assume that because this is going on in the Northern Hemisphere, the same thing is going on in the Southern Hemisphere. So we really need more data in the global south, and we need to be promoting natural data collection in these regions, because we can't just assume everything that's happening in Europe and North America is the same down for us. So some of the take-home messages from my talk are that plants can respond to climate change, and this is really good news for our ecosystems. Different aspects of climate change are impacting different aspects of plant growth, and we really need to determine these factors to better predict outcomes for plant species in the future. And different parts of the globe show very different plant species responses to climate change, and we really need more information from the global south. We can't just blanket statement what we're finding in Europe and North America, where most of the data is coming from, counts for the whole world. So thanks so much for coming along and listening to my talk. Thanks to my volunteers and my research assistants and all the organisations that I worked at to do this research. And also a big thanks to my current university and also REACH as well. Thank you so much for having me.